Cuba, run since 1898 as an American colony, has itself a revolution under Fidel Castro in 1959. Cuba had been run by the Americans as kind of like a plaything sort of place since it took over there in 1898. By the time of the Cuban Revolution, 1st of January 1959, a dictator called Batista ruled the country. So the US had been there since 1898. Batista, brutal dictator, had been running the country. He'd been running it in such a way as to make the local people very, very, very unhappy. With great brutality. But he basically ruled it for American business interests, who controlled 70% of Cuban agriculture at that time. Batista ruled with great cruelty and great authoritarianism up until the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution, whereby a group of revolutionaries, Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, got on a boat, went to Cuba, and eventually, 1st of January 1959, overthrew Batista. When the revolution happened, when Castro took over Cuba and started to nationalize Cuban assets, then first Eisenhower and then Kennedy thought they had to do something about it. They would not let this stand. They launched plans to remove Castro, to sabotage, to assassinate, to invade if they had to. From here they began nationalising private industries. Bearing in mind foreign companies, foreign American companies owned about 70% of Cuba at that point. It was something that Castro felt he needed to do in order to get his own country back, but of course something that, despite holding out an olive branch, despite not really wanting conflict with the United States, this was going to cause conflict because it was American companies that were being nationalized. Eisenhower and JFK both thought, oh lordy, good lord, do something. Kennedy did whatever he could to get rid of Castro. He launched the Bay of Pigs invasion. He tried several failed assassination attempts. You see, the issue, the revolution was not necessarily communist. It wasn't necessarily pro-USSR. The American leadership made it this way. At first Castro wanted to carry on doing business with the United States. However, the United States flatly refused to process refused to process Cuban oil and buy Cuban sugar, which put the Cuban economy and therefore Cuba into a really, really awful state. And so Cuba was forced to turn to the Soviet Union, first as a trading partner and then for protection against the assassination attempts and invasions such as the Bay of Pigs. When Kennedy realized that there were missiles on Cuba, there were missiles on Cuba and there were boats on the way, he decided to blockade with boats, to make a ring of steel, if you like, around Cuba and not allow any more of these nuclear missiles onto Cuba. Figuring it was about as offensive putting them on Cuba as the Americans putting missiles in Turkey, which they'd actually already done. The world waited for a nuclear holocaust as Khrushchev and Kennedy negotiated against this backdrop of a naval blockade. And then in the end, much to everyone's relief, a deal was done and missiles were taken from Cuba and removed from Turkey. A period of détente or relaxation followed, and a hotline was put in to make sure that the warlike shoutings of the leadership shouldn't actually ever be mistaken for real war manoeuvres. Cuban Missile Crisis worked out all right in the end. Didn't it, Porridge? Cuba, small island in the Caribbean, run as an American colony since 1898. Has a revolution, kicks out a dictator. Revolution is then opposed by the United States. The revolution turns to Khrushchev and Russian nuclear missiles. Massive standoff, diffused tension.